Hello there, sewing friends. My name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. So if you've been watching my channel, you know I have a couple of grandkids and they're small. Got another one on the way too. That's pretty exciting. But they don't really have anything for their Halloween treats when they go trick-or-treating. I have a bag full of Halloween scraps. So come along with me today and I'm going to show you how I turned my Halloween scraps into cute little trick-or-treat buckets for the grandkids. Sorting out scraps is always a lot of fun for me. I get to remember where I picked up certain fabrics. For example, those light orange fabrics, I got those in a grab bag garage sale. In that same grab bag garage sale, I got this white background fabric with spooky stories and interesting things. I thought that would make a good fabric for the lining of my treat buckets. The first thing I needed to decide was what method I was going to use to construct a Halloween treat bag. I thought about making something similar to all the grocery totes that I'm always making. If you follow my channel, you know I'm always making a new grocery tote. But today I wanted to try something a little bit different. I'm cutting a couple of long rectangles from my scrap batting stash. Now, I've never done this before, but my idea is that I'm going to make a tube out of the long rectangles and then attach a circular bottom. I used a plastic plate to draw a line to make a circle. Next, I cut out around the circle with 2 layers of batting because I'm going to be making 2 buckets. I am not cutting exactly on the line. I am going to be trimming these down again later anyway, once I get fabric on them. Initially, I just eyeballed these rectangles to make sure they were mostly going to go around these circles. I set the circles aside and I got out that white fabric that I was going to use for the lining, the inside of my little Halloween bucket. Now this fabric is directional, so it is important that you make sure the up and the down are the way you want them when you attach them to the bucket bottom. But if your fabric is not directional, no worries. And I was lucky this piece was long enough to make 2 long strips, and I did not have to piece them together to get a long enough piece. At this point, my batting rectangles are about 8 inches wide and about 24 inches long. And now I'm going to make sure the right side is down, the batting is in the middle, and then I'll be ready to start sewing scraps in a quilt as you go method. I laid out my rectangle piece with the lining of the bucket fabric, right side down, and I am going to start stitching in the middle of this. I'm going to take a couple of pieces of fabric that are long enough for the batting and start with that, and I'm going to put these pieces right sides together and stitch. I'm going to keep going to my little scrap pile and I'm going to try to alternate colors. When I have pieces that are too small and are not going to go all the way across this batting, I'm going to stitch those together with other scrap pieces until it's long enough. Now, one other note about the directional fabric. So my lining fabric that's on the bottom of this is right side up. So the top of that fabric is away from me. So all these fabrics I'm putting on this right side of the top layer now, which is going to be the outside of the bag, I'm making sure if those fabrics are also directional, they're going the same way. When I'm stitching all these tiny scrap pieces together to add in a strip, I am going off camera and pressing these flat before I add them to the rest. Now, my advice to you is have your scraps somewhere else. I kept knocking into that scrap pile over there and it got all mixed up. I had it all neat and organized into colors, and every time I added a new piece, especially toward the end of these strips, I would be knocking into those scraps. I was able to use some big triangles that came from another quilt project. When I flipped this rectangle around to do the opposite side, I made sure that any scrap fabric I was adding was now upside down because the directional fabric on the bottom was now upside down. With all the fabric scraps added to the outside of my little bucket bag, I went ahead and started quilting. This is the way I'm quilting it. I've got this little decorative stitch that's built into my sewing machine, and I'm just making little rows of this stitching about 2 inches apart from each other. For bucket number 2, I thought I would lay out the fabrics on top of the batting first so that I would have less of a problem with knocking them off my table. But finally, I just moved all those scraps onto the floor next to my workspace. For the bottom of the bucket, I rough cut out an orange fabric for the inside and a dark gray fabric for the bottom of the bucket. Next, using a serpentine stitch, I just went around from the center of the circle to the outside in a spiral. Next, I use that same plastic plate to trim my perfect circle. No plates were harmed during the making of this video. I measured around the outside of these circles with a tape measure, and that diameter was about 25 inches. Now, I wasn't too worried about my rectangles being more along the lines of 24, 24 and a half. That didn't worry me at all because as we work this bottom into the side, as long as they're close, it's going to work out. Not knowing exactly how deep I wanted these buckets to be, the first thing I did was trim them to 8 inches wide. First, I made a straight edge on one side of the rectangle, one of the longer sides. When I rotated this unit around the other way, I put my smaller ruler lining up the 2-inch line on that straight edge I just cut, and then I used my 6-inch wide ruler so I could get a nice long cut that made this piece 8 inches wide. I tested this rectangle out around the bucket, and then I was trying to think of ways I was going to join this, and I was thinking about maybe adding a binding strip to hide that seam, but I'll show you what I ended up doing, which is creative. I've never done it before, but it worked out great. But first I realized that bucket was too deep at 8 inches, so I just cut off 2 inches and made it an even 6 inches deep. I knew that I needed some strips for binding this bag, so I needed to bind the top of the bag plus the seam at the bottom of the bag. Now here's where I'm showing you the idea I came up with. I thought if I folded one part of the outside of the bag down upon itself, and then I folded the opposite part the opposite way where I was folding the lining on itself, I could nest those two seams together and that would hide the raw edge. And here's a slow close-up look at how that is going to work. You can see I've got one side of this opening folded one way, the other side is folded the opposite way, and then they're going to get stitched together like that, and that will hide the raw edge. First, I stitched down those flaps so they would remain secure. Now I'm going to nest those edges together and stitch this seam together. Now here's a close-up. I've stitched a few stitches on this, but you can see I'm making a U shape to keep the rest of that bucket out of the way, so I'm not stitching anything underneath anything else. After stitching that first seam, I took a look at the inside and I decided to go ahead and top stitch this little loose flap down as well, so we wouldn't have any flaps or any raw edges showing. And again, you can see I'm just grabbing the rest of that bucket in a U shape to keep it out of the way of my needle. With both of those tubes completed, I'm ready to attach the bottom of the bucket. Now I want the orange to be on the inside and the dark gray to be on the bottom. So it kind of took me a minute to figure out exactly how to pin this together. I wanted to bind the seam on the inside of the bag. Now here you see I'm marking my tube so I get even marks on opposite sides. Then I'm opening the tube, putting those first two marks together and making two additional marks on the other sides. And in this way, I am going to have an equal matching point because I'm going to mark my little circle in the same way. And you may notice I started using a pen to mark, but it really wasn't showing up. And I decided, well, I have to pin this anyway, so let's just use pens to mark everything. I have been a stitcher of clothing from time to time, so putting in a sleeve is something I'm familiar with, but I still had to wrap my head around getting this orange to the inside of the bag and figuring out what I had to pin together. So basically I needed to put the outside of the bag right sides together with the bottom of the bag. It took me a few minutes to wrap my head around that. Since I had placed 4 pins that marked the 4 quadrants of each circular shape, I first went around and matched up those 4 pins. Once I had the 4 main pins in place, I was able to go back around the circle and add more pins. I spaced my pins about 1 to 2 inches apart. I could have cut this purple strip a little bit thinner, but I already had it cut to 2.5 inches, so I just left it. I folded down the leading edge of this purple fabric as a means to hide raw edges. Next, I went all the way around the inside of this bag, stitching that purple fabric and making the inside seam. I don't want to cut any of this filming out here. I want you to see that I'm constantly rearranging the fabric bucket that's underneath here. I'm just doing maybe 1 inch of seam at a time. Then I'm moving, rotating that purple binding around the circle. When I reach the beginning, I just trim off a little bit of the purple just so it overlaps that fold that I had made, and then I go ahead and stitch the rest of that tail end down. Now, depending on how wide you cut your binding, you'll fold it differently, but I'm folding it once, then twice, and then over that seam, and I'm going to be using clips to clip this into place all the way around the bucket. With all the clipping done, I just took it to the machine and stitched that purple binding down. This part is probably the hardest part of doing this bucket. You can see I'm using my little stitch ripper to kind of poke. I'm using it as a stylus to poke my purple fabric so it doesn't get missed by the needle when I stitch. I'm going to turn this bag so the right side is out, and you can see we have a nice seam on the outside of the bucket, and then we've got that purple binding on the inside hiding those raw edges. I got the inside binding of bucket number 2 finished, and then it was time to add binding to the top of these buckets. I'm going to do these the way I normally do binding on a quilt. I take a 2.5-inch strip, I fold down that leading edge at a 45-degree angle, and then I fold that binding in half and press it. I'm going to stitch this binding first to the inside of the bag, the bucket, and then I'll be flipping it around to the outside of the bucket to finish it. I don't stitch down that leading edge of the binding because I'm going to need to tuck in the tail end of this binding when I get around the bucket. Here's a little close-up view of the end. I've got that overlapping tail, and I've got the opening that I left with that 45-degree fold at the beginning. What I'm going to do is cut this tail off to match that angle of the fold, just with a little bit of overlap, maybe a 1/2 inch. And that is going to allow me to tuck that tail right into that fold. Next, I'm going to fold this binding over to the outside of my bucket. I'm going to get that all clipped into place, and then I will go around and stitch that top binding down. If you've watched any of my grocery tote videos, you know that I like to have part of the handle strap attached before I do this top binding. In this case, these little buckets are so small, I don't need to worry about that. They're going to be lightweight, and the strap is going to be plenty strong enough. With both of the buckets ready to top stitch down that top binding, I did a couple of decorative stitches that are on my machine. I have a spider web, I have some little pumpkins, and a bat. I removed the little acrylic insert for my sewing table, and I'm going to top stitch this binding down to the top of my buckets. I'm going to do the pumpkin on one and the spider web on the second one. Now it's time to stitch down the handle straps. I'm just using a simple nylon web strap that's about 1 inch wide. The way I'm going to stitch this down to the top of the bag, I'm going to make a square, and then I'm going to make an X inside the square. And there you have it, a couple of cute Halloween bucket totes for kids to get their Halloween candy. They're so cute. I love these cute, spooky fabrics. I think my favorite is the orange and white and black with green eyes pumpkins. They look really scary. I am going to take one further step that you won't see here. I'm going to embroider stitch their names onto the straps, along with more pumpkins and more spider webs. Well, if you've stuck with me this far, I really appreciate your support of my channel. Leave a comment, and I love to hear what you guys have to say, and if this has inspired you, you're always welcome to send a picture or post that on my community page on the YouTube app. All the comments, likes, shares, and subscribes do help that YouTube algorithm know that people like my channel. So if you want to help me to grow this channel, please feel free to do any of that you choose. And on the day of recording this, I will be going over to the kids' house in about 4 hours to hand these off and see how the kids like them. I'll leave an additional note in the description of the video to let you know how they were received by the 2 grandkids who are right now, they're 2 and 4 years old. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you back again real soon.